It was quiet in the palace that morning, not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that holds its breath before disaster. Beyond the towering vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, the empire continued its daily rhythm. Markets opened, officials marched to court, peasants bowed to invisible power. But inside the inner court, every step, every whisper, every glance was laced with fear. The emperor was dying. They didn't say it aloud, of course. In the imperial palace, even death was forbidden until it became undeniable, until the physician's trembling hands pulled away from the emperor's pulse and didn't return. When the final breath left his lips, no one moved. Not the eunuchs holding incense, not the concubines kneeling in silence, not the guards stationed outside his door, who had heard the muffled coughing for weeks. It was done. The Son of Heaven was gone, and in that moment, dozens of women knew their fate had already been sealed. She was one of them, a concubine. Her name isn't remembered by most. You won't find her carved into stone or painted in silk scrolls. Historians rarely mention her, but she was there, a woman barely 20 years old, wrapped in red silk, brought into the palace 5 years earlier during the emperor's third selection ceremony. Like the others, she had no choice. Her father had bowed deeply when the letter arrived announcing her selection. It was the greatest honor, to be chosen by the emperor himself among thousands. But no one told her what happened after the emperor died. No one spoke of that. It began with a silence deeper than death. When an emperor dies in the Forbidden City, everything stops. The clocks, the laughter, the music, even the birds seem to know. And the women, his concubines, his so-called fortunate ones, wait for the decree. Would they be dismissed? Would they be allowed to return home, live as widows, maybe even remarry? No, not in this dynasty. In this dynasty, they were buried with him. The ritual had a name, Tuizang, burial by companionship, in public. It was called a great honor. To accompany the emperor into the afterlife, to serve him as they had in life. It was considered loyalty, purity, the highest devotion. But the truth was far more brutal. The concubines were gathered. Some cried, some collapsed. Others stood in stone silence, already detached from their bodies. The eunuchs handed them white silk scarves, beautiful, embroidered, and deadly. Each woman was led to a private chamber. Guards posted outside. No way in, no way out. There were no screaming protests, no begging for life. That had all been trained out of them long ago. The silence continued. She sat alone in the chamber, the scarf in her hands. It smelled of camphor and jasmine. She stared at the wooden frame above her. They had prepared everything. They always did. She thought of her mother, her little brother, a red ribbon from childhood. She had not seen her family in 5 years. Not once. She had sent letters, carefully written, reviewed by court officials, then rewritten until the words meant nothing. Now, there would be no more letters. Outside, the palace prepared for the funeral. Drums sounded, incense burned. Officials rehearsed eulogies in poetic form, praising the emperor's wisdom, his military victories, his divine favor. But inside the palace walls, the women of the inner court were dying, one by one, quietly, properly, as they had been trained to do. Some, they said, took their own lives. Others were helped. There was no public record of how many concubines died that day. Some historians estimate 12. Others say 20. Unofficial accounts whispered of 40. Their names are not carved in stone, Their lives are not studied in schools. In the official records, their deaths are written in passive voice. Accompanied His Majesty into the next world. She did not die that night. That is why we know her story. Because something, some flicker of resistance, some thread of survival, pulled her back from the edge. She hid. It seems impossible in the most guarded palace in the world, but she did. For days, she drank water from flower bowls, ate scraps left behind in servants' quarters. She clothed herself in rags to appear invisible. She walked only at night. No one knows exactly how she escaped. Some say a eunuch helped her. Others believe she slipped out during the funeral procession, disguised as one of the mourners. Years later, a poem was found, unsigned, tucked inside an old book in a forgotten monastery. It read, "He died with golden robes and drums. We died with nothing but silence. But I chose breath over honor and lived with the shame of freedom." Some believe she wrote it. We may never know, but we do know this. When the emperor died, his concubines did not simply mourn. Some were buried, some were broken, and one disappeared into history. To understand what they did after the emperor died, you have to understand what they endured while he lived. The Forbidden City was vast. Over 9,000 rooms, courtyards upon courtyards, golden roofs that shimmered in sunlight. From the outside, it looked like heaven on earth. But for the women inside, it was a cage gilded in fear. The concubines were chosen from noble families, carefully screened for their beauty, manners, and family background. Once selected, they were brought to the palace at age 14, 15, sometimes younger. Their names were changed. Their hair was styled in imperial fashion, their dialects corrected, their memories rewritten. They were taught how to bow, how to smile, how to speak only when spoken to. They learned how to cry without tears. They were not wives. They were property. There was a hierarchy, as there always is. At the top stood the empress, powerful, untouchable, and often the most politically dangerous woman in the empire. Below her were the noble consorts, then the concubines, then the talented women, then the women with no rank, servants in name, but also concubines in waiting. No matter how many women lived in the inner court, only one held the emperor's attention at a time. The others waited in silence, hoping to be summoned. Some waited years, some were never called. They competed not with words, but with glances, with silence, with poison slipped into teacups. If you gained the emperor's favor, you rose. If you bore him a son, you secured your future, maybe even your family's future. But if he lost interest, you were forgotten. She had been summoned 3 times in 5 years. That was considered lucky. The first time, she was too terrified to speak. The second time, he didn't look at her. The third time, he held her hand as she cried, but by morning, he had forgotten her name. She never blamed him. How could she? He was the emperor. She was just another name on a scroll. But it was in those quiet years of being forgotten that she learned the true language of the palace. She learned how to survive. The palace had its secrets, more than anyone outside could ever imagine. Women vanished in the night and were never mentioned again. Servants whispered about a garden courtyard where no one was allowed to enter, where a woman had once screamed for 3 nights before silence swallowed her. There were rumors of punishment halls beneath the West Wing, where concubines who defied orders were re-educated, or worse. She saw things. A servant girl dragged by her hair into the shadows, blood cleaned before dawn, gifts poisoned with lotus oil, a mother weeping quietly when her infant son was taken away, never to be seen again. This was the cost of proximity to power, but they didn't all suffer the same. Some concubines lived like queens, bathed in rose water, fed bird's nest soup, gifted jade jewelry. They laughed, played music, wrote poetry, attended moon festivals in silken gowns. But even they knew none of it belonged to them. Their beauty could buy them time, but not safety. Their status could raise them high, but never high enough to stand alone. All of them, every woman inside those palace walls, lived under one law. When the emperor dies, you no longer have a purpose. That law had no name, no official decree, but it was practiced, generation after generation. In some dynasties, the concubines were forced to take poison, sometimes buried alive, sometimes strangled with silk cords in the name of honor. In other houses, they were locked away in separate quarters, left to rot in silence, forbidden from remarrying, their faces covered so no man could look upon them again. They were the emperors even after death, even when he no longer remembered them, even when they had never spoken a word to him, even when they had only been chosen to fill a number on a roster. She had heard the stories from older women in the court. One told her of an empress who slit her own throat rather than be humiliated during a forced burial. Another spoke of a girl who swallowed jade so her death wouldn't be silent. Most of the stories ended the same way. She was never seen again. No names, no bodies, no tombstones, only stories. And stories, in the palace, were often more dangerous than facts. Still, she listened. She collected those whispers like pearls, each one a warning, a prayer, a secret wrapped in silence. She did not cry when she heard of the emperor's illness. She did not pray for his recovery. She only waited. She knew that his death would not just end his reign, it would trigger something far more terrifying, something ancient, something buried in tradition and silence. And when that time came, she would not die for a man who had never truly seen her. It came without warning. There had been rumors, of course, whispers among eunuchs, a changed routine, meals untouched, physicians arriving in the dead of night. But no one dared to speak the words aloud. The emperor was dying. In the Forbidden City, news didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in like fog, unseen, unannounced, but everywhere. The concubines felt it first in their bones. Breakfast was delayed. Incense, usually burned only in temples, now filled every hallway. The empress walked past without a word, her face pale, her eyes sunken with sleeplessness. Then, just after the midday bell, the sound of the morning gong, one slow strike, then silence, then another. Every soul in the palace froze. The gong didn't need a voice. It spoke across time. The Son of Heaven was gone. She was in her chamber when it happened. The red curtain trembled, not from wind, but from the breath she had just lost. She had known it would come, but not like this. Not so soon, not so real. Her hands shook as she folded her robe properly, as they had taught her. She brushed her hair into a low knot, avoiding her own reflection in the mirror. A eunuch came to the door. He didn't speak. He only bowed and held out a scroll. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was written in ceremonial calligraphy, so elegant it almost hid the meaning. In honor of His Majesty's passing, the following attendants shall be selected for eternal service. Her name was there. There was no scream, no refusal. That was not allowed. She bowed, accepted the scroll, and shut the door. Then She sat in silence. Outside, drums began to beat. The morning ritual. Flags were lowered. The outer court lined up in rows of silence, robes the color of ashes, heads bowed beneath the weight of heaven's loss. Inside the women's quarters, the concubines were already being gathered. Not all of them, just the selected ones, chosen not for love or loyalty, but for symmetry, for ceremony, for death by tradition. That night, the palace gates were locked from the inside. No one entered, no one left. The selected concubines were taken to the Hall of Pure Quietude, a building that had not been used in decades. There were 14 of them. They were told to wear their finest red robes, the same color they had worn on the day of their selection. The day they were brought into the palace, the color of celebration, the color of blood. She walked in silence. Her feet made no sound on the polished stone. Her hands were folded, perfectly still. Her hair was adorned with gold pins shaped like phoenixes. She had not cried. She did not know if that was strength or surrender. As they entered the hall, a eunuch handed each woman a silk scarf. White, pure, soft to the touch. "Please," he said, voice trembling, "for the glory of the empire." No one replied. There was nothing left to say. Each woman was led to a private room. There were no windows, just a low lamp, a woven mat, and the scarf. Some women prayed. Others whispered names from their childhoods. One woman sang softly, just a lullaby, barely audible. And then, one by one, the lights went out. She sat on the mat for what felt like hours. The scarf lay across her lap, heavy with meaning. She thought of her mother's hands brushing her hair when she was a child, of the swing that hung from a plum tree outside her family's home, of the first time she saw snowfall on the palace rooftops. She thought of the emperor's hand, once placed gently on her shoulder, then forgotten. He wouldn't remember her name in death. Why should she die for his? Then something changed. A sound, faint, barely there. A step, a whisper, a hesitation. She didn't move. Then, a knock. 3 soft taps on her chamber door. She rose slowly, scarf in hand, heart pounding. The door creaked open. A eunuch stood there, not one she knew well. His eyes were full of something she didn't recognize. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. He said only 4 words, "Come with me, now." She followed him, without asking why, down narrow corridors, through storage halls, past rooms no one used anymore. The palace was sleeping, but not peacefully. It was the sleep of a city in mourning, a sleep that feared waking. Finally, he stopped before a small wooden door behind a tapestry. She had never seen it before. He turned to her, voice barely audible. "If they find you, we both die." Then he opened the door and vanished into the shadows. She stepped through. What lay beyond that door would change everything, not just for her, but for every woman who would one day wear red for a man she never loved. This was no longer just a story of death. This was the beginning of a different kind of survival. The passage behind the tapestry was narrow, cold, and silent. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than her footsteps. The stone beneath her feet was uneven, the walls close enough to brush her sleeves. There was no light, only the distant flicker of a flame far ahead, like a fading memory leading her into the unknown. She had never seen this part of the palace before. That, in itself, was extraordinary. She had lived within these walls for 5 years. She had walked its courtyards, bathed in its pools, listened to gossip echo through its halls. But this place, the hidden corridor behind the tapestry, was not part of the palace she knew. It was older, forgotten, like the women who had once walked it. The eunuch was gone. He had disappeared as quickly as he'd come. Whether he had saved her or abandoned her, she did not know. There was no time to wonder. She pressed forward, holding her breath at every corner, every sound, every distant creak of the walls felt like a blade hovering in the dark. She could still hear the palace behind her, the muffled rhythm of ritual drums, the distant chants of mourning, the quiet death of obedience. But now, she was outside the script, no longer a character in the emperor's funeral. Now, she was something else, unwritten, unprotected. The corridor ended at a wooden door with iron hinges, rusted, old, marked by time. She placed her palm against the wood and paused. If she stepped through, there would be no returning. No hiding behind silk veils. No pretending to be loyal, silent, dead. There would only be breath or discovery. She pushed the door open. It led to an abandoned courtyard. The sky above was dark, heavy with stars. No lanterns lit this place. No guards patrolled its walls. It was part of the palace, yet utterly outside of it. The buildings around her were crumbling. Ivy curled over roof tiles. Stone lions lay cracked and forgotten. The air smelled of earth and dust and old incense. This was a place erased from memory. She had found the graveyard of the living. There were signs that others had been there. Broken sandals near the base of a tree. A single comb, lacquered in red, half buried in dirt. A shredded sash tied around a wooden beam. And on the wall, written faintly in charcoal, barely visible, was a line of poetry. Those who refuse to die may still vanish in silence. She read it once, then again. Who had written it? Another concubine? A servant? A prisoner who had escaped only to be forgotten? She would never know, but she understood its meaning too well. She stayed there for the rest of the night, hidden in the ruins, wrapped in her red robe, now stained with dust, watching the stars and waiting for morning, if it ever came. She did not sleep. Sleep was dangerous, in places where you were not supposed to be alive. Instead, she thought about her family, about the girl she had been before the palace, about the other concubines, the ones who had not escaped. Were they gone already? Had the ceremony taken them? Had their names already been struck from the registry? She had known some of them. Not well. Concubines were discouraged from forming bonds, but she remembered their voices, their eyes, the way they clutched their scarves. She remembered the lullaby one had sung, soft, fragile, like something that knew it was about to disappear. When dawn finally came, the sky bled a colorless gray. She moved carefully, keeping close to shadows. She followed walls instead of paths. She walked only when no footsteps echoed. She needed a plan, but she had none. The palace was a maze, and she had no map. The guards were trained to spot imposters. The walls were too high to climb. And the moment her face was recognized, it would all be over. And yet, she refused to believe she had survived the night only to die in daylight. She would not go back to the chamber. She would not wear the scarf. She would not be buried with a man who never truly looked at her. Midday passed. Then afternoon. She drank from a shallow pond, fed by rainwater. She ate 2 dried plums she had hidden in her sleeve during the last offering ceremony. Hunger clawed at her, but fear kept it quiet. The palace around her moved in mourning. Officials wept with scripted sorrow. Ceremonies continued. The fire of tradition burned without question, and no one knew she was alive. In the evening, she found a place to hide, a storage shed behind the garden wall, half buried by overgrown vines, its door loose and creaking. Inside were boxes of broken decorations, faded festival lanterns, and wooden dolls used for past rituals. She slid behind the crates and pressed herself into the corner, knees drawn to her chest. There, in the dark, she did what she hadn't done since the moment she saw her name on the scroll. She cried, but not from fear, from anger. The palace had demanded everything: her name, her youth, her voice, her future, and now it wanted her death. But she had something the palace never accounted for: a choice, however small, however fragile. She still had it, and she would use it. The next morning, she woke to the sound of footsteps. Not loud, not hurried, deliberate. She stayed perfectly still behind the crates. Dust clung to her face. Her legs were stiff. Her silk robe had lost its shape, wrinkled and dulled from hours of hiding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then, a knock. Not the kind meant to announce authority, not the thunder of a guard or the stomp of a eunuch on patrol. Just one knock, soft, hesitant, then silence. She didn't move, and after a long moment, the footsteps walked away. It could have been anyone: a servant, a searcher, a mistake. But her heart told her it was something else. Someone new. She had been seen. By the third day, the hunger became harder to ignore. She felt it in her bones, in her head, in the way her hands shook when she tried to tie her robe. Her tongue was dry, her thoughts blurred at the edges. She began to see things, shadows moving where there were none, the glint of eyes in the dark that vanished when she blinked. And worse, she began to imagine the scarf. She could still feel it in her lap, white, soft, final. A part of her wondered if she should have stayed, not out of fear, but exhaustion. Was survival worth this? To be hunted by silence? To exist only in cracks of space? To be a ghost inside a palace that had already erased her name? That evening, as the sun dipped behind the palace walls, she heard it again. A knock, then after a pause, a whisper: "Are you still alive?" Her breath caught in her throat. She crawled to the door and pressed her ear to the wood. The voice came again, a whisper, female, careful, urgent. "You don't have long. They're checking every wing now. I can help you, if you want to live." There was a pause. Then the voice added, "But you have to decide now." She opened the door. Standing there, eyes wide, was a girl, not a concubine, not a court lady, a servant. She wore a faded tunic, hair pulled back in a rough knot. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "Come," before the guards circled back. There was no time for questions, no names exchanged, no promises made, only motion, only escape. The girl led her through side passages known only to those who cleaned them. They crawled beneath kitchen platforms, slipped behind bathhouse screens, moved silently through linen halls, and behind scroll-covered storage doors. Once, they paused in a hallway as two eunuchs passed by, talking of the empress's grief and how many concubines had already fulfilled their duty. They didn't mention her name, because, as far as the palace knew, she was already dead. The servant led her to a tiny chamber near the old bell tower, long since unused. The windows were papered shut, the floor dusty, but it had a door and water, and for the first time in 3 days, safety. "I can bring you food tomorrow," the girl said, "but you can't stay long." The concubine nodded, still trembling. "Why are you helping me?" she finally whispered. The girl looked down. "My aunt was a concubine," she said. "She was chosen when I was a child. My family never saw her again. I always wondered, did she want to die? Or was she just forgotten?" She met the concubine's eyes. I don't want you to be forgotten. Then, without another word, the girl left. That night, she slept. Not deeply, not peacefully, but without fear. And in her dreams, she saw the scarf again, not as a noose, but as a banner, a symbol of what she had escaped. The next day, the servant girl returned. She brought a small cloth bundle, steamed rice, dried turnip, salted fish. The concubine ate slowly, hands shaking with relief. She asked no questions. Neither did the girl. But before leaving, the girl paused at the door. They're preparing the tomb, she said quietly. The emperor's body will be moved in 5 days. They want everything perfect. She hesitated. They say only 12 women died. The concubine froze. 12. There had been 14. The palace had noticed. They were short 2 names. And in a palace where everything was controlled, rituals, numbers, symmetry, 2 missing deaths was not a mistake they would tolerate. They'll look harder now, the girl said. Then she handed her a bundle of cloth. For tomorrow, you'll need to change your clothes. Inside was a servant's robe. Old, faded, but it meant freedom. For the first time since her name appeared on the scroll, she had a plan. She would not run. She would become invisible. The robe was rough, poorly stitched, the sleeves uneven. It smelled of smoke and storage. It fit awkwardly, too loose in the shoulders, too short at the wrists. But it was perfect, because no one remembered the names of servants. The next morning, before first light, she walked out of the bell tower and into the palace, not as a concubine, not as a fugitive, but as something far more powerful, invisible. She carried a basket filled with folded towels. The servant girl had prepared everything: items to carry, a route to follow, and 3 short phrases to say if stopped. Laundry delivery. Requested by the Empress's wing. I was told to hurry. No one asked her name. No one looked at her face. The palace was in mourning. But beneath the surface, it was restless. Officials marched in tighter formations. Eunuchs whispered urgently behind doors. The Empress had issued new restrictions: daily head counts, surprise checks in servant quarters, forbidden zones doubled. Too many questions had gone unanswered. 2 concubines were still missing, and the funeral was approaching. The image of imperial perfection had to be preserved. No scandal, no uncertainty, no imbalance, only harmony, even in death. She kept her head down. She bowed when spoken to. She listened, and what she heard chilled her to the bone. They're searching the archives, a cook whispered in passing, cross-referencing names, verifying handwriting, looking for discrepancies. Some think one of the eunuchs lied, another said. They executed 3 already, quietly. They're recounting the ashes, someone muttered. They want 12 to match the scroll. 12, not 10, not 11. 12 women, 12 scarves, 12 silent deaths. She worked all day without rest, carrying laundry, fetching water, pretending she had always belonged. Every moment was a test. Every hallway, a trap. Once, a court lady glanced too long at her. Another time, a guard paused beside her, frowning slightly. Perhaps sensing something was off. She held her breath, lowered her gaze, and passed, but it wouldn't last forever. That night, she returned to the bell tower. The servant girl was waiting. They'll find you soon, she said softly. Someone will recognize you, or the numbers won't add up. They're building the tomb now. When it's finished, there will be no more chances. The concubine nodded. I'm leaving the palace, the girl said suddenly. I've arranged a place with a merchant's family outside the city. If I stay, they'll find out what I did. She hesitated, then handed the concubine a folded paper. Go to this address. Wait until the funeral ends. Then follow the lanterns. She smiled faintly. It's not much. but it's a place where you can have a name again." Then she was gone. The concubine stayed behind in the dark. She unfolded the paper. Inside was a map, a gate, a path, a mark on the wall, a final chance. She held it in her hands like it was life itself, because it was. The next day, the palace bells rang earlier than usual. She knew the sound now. Low, mournful, ceremonial, but this time, something was different. The sound was faster, urgent, a bell for morning, and a bell for alert. Word spread before sunrise. One of the concubine's bodies had been exhumed. There was a problem. The ashes did not match the records. The scarf was not embroidered correctly. The silk had been altered. Someone had forged a death. Someone had faked a ritual. Someone was still alive. Panic moved like a storm through the court. Doors were sealed. Movements restricted. Servants interrogated. Rooms searched. Old scrolls unrolled and reread. The Empress herself issued a decree. All women within the inner court shall be accounted for by dusk. No exceptions. That afternoon, as she washed linens by the garden wall, a voice rang out behind her. "You there, remove your veil." She froze. Her hand tightened on the wet cloth. Slowly, she turned. A court official stood before her, young, sharp-eyed, not easily fooled. "I haven't seen you before," he said. She bowed, heart hammering. "I was assigned from the outer kitchens yesterday." He studied her. "You're not on the register." Silence. Then, "She's one of them," a voice shouted from behind. Another servant. A girl she didn't recognize, pointing, eyes wide, backing away. "She's not one of us." It happened quickly. Guards seized her arms. The basket fell. The cloths scattered. Her red robe, hidden beneath the servant garb, spilled from the folds. Gasps. Footsteps. Then silence. Someone whispered, "She's the missing one." They dragged her through the palace in chains. Not iron, silk rope. Even in disgrace, a concubine's wrists must appear elegant. She was paraded through courtyards she once walked with dignity. Past walls that had once hidden her sorrow. Past women who now covered their mouths in horror or curiosity. They took her to the Hall of Ancestral Judgment. She was no longer invisible. She had become a symbol, a threat, a question no one wanted asked. She knelt in silence as officials debated her fate. Some demanded execution. Others insisted secrecy. The Empress had not spoken. Then, after hours of whispers, a decision. They didn't execute her. That would have been too simple, too final, too visible. Instead, they did what the palace always did with things it could not explain. They erased her. The decision came not as a declaration, but as a whisper. She will not be named in the record. She will not be listed among the dead or the living. She will not be buried. She will not be mourned. The Empress signed the decree with ink so light it barely marked the page. One of the eunuchs asked, cautiously, "What shall we do with her?" The answer came in one line: "Hide her where silence grows." They took her to the northern wing, not to a cell, not to the execution yard, but to a building without signs, without guards, without purpose. A place once used to store ceremonial scrolls and unused relics. A place where voices didn't echo and footsteps died in the dust. A forgotten chamber for forgotten things. They sealed the doors behind her. No trial, no questions, no final rites. Just silence and time. At first, she thought it would kill her. The darkness, the loneliness, the knowledge that her death would have at least been seen. But this was undeath, unbeing, a breathing void. They left her food, rice, water, nothing more. They never spoke to her. never looked her in the eye. She was not a prisoner. She was not a woman. She was not anything. She was the answer to a riddle no one wanted solved. Outside, the emperor's tomb was completed. A grand ceremony. Music. Lanterns. Doves released to the sky. 12 concubines named, praised, immortalized in stone. Her name was not among them because, in the empire's eyes, she never existed. But time moved differently in exile. She stopped counting days. She forgot the taste of honey. She spoke only to the walls. She dreamed in silence. And yet, she did not die. And that was her rebellion, not the escape, not the disguise, not the moment she was caught. But this, the act of continuing, of breathing, even when breath no longer mattered to anyone, of remembering, even when memory had become a curse. She refused to give the palace what it truly wanted, oblivion. One night, she found a piece of charcoal under a loose tile, maybe left by a previous prisoner, maybe by a careless scribe, maybe placed there by mercy. She used it, not to write a plea for help, not to draw a window, not to count the days, but to carve one sentence into the wall. I lived. That was all. No name, no date, no plea. Just truth, proof that a soul had endured in silence. Years passed. New concubines were chosen. New emperors crowned. The empire moved on. Forgotten names faded deeper into the stone. But sometimes, when the servant swept the old corridors, or when a storm broke tiles loose from the roof, someone would whisper, "There's still someone in the northern wing." They never said her name, because no one remembered it. But the story survived. Barely. In lullabies, in servant songs, in the creak of the door that would not open, in the legend of the concubine who would not die. She became a ghost, but not a spirit of vengeance, a spirit of refusal, a woman who would not disappear, no matter how deeply history tried to bury her. One winter, the doors were found open, no one knows how. The lock was untouched, the seals unbroken. Inside, nothing, no body, no dishes, no footprints, just dust. And a single line on the wall. I lived. The words still faintly visible. Some say she escaped again. Others believe she faded quietly, her spirit at peace. But among the palace servants, a different story grew, that she became a shadow in the court, a woman in plain robes, seen only in passing, helping the youngest servants learn the silent rules, whispering warnings before disasters, leaving dried plum seeds in the beds of grieving girls, always gone before she could be seen clearly, always watching, never cruel, only there. Because sometimes survival is not a rebellion, it's a legacy. History is written by men, by scribes with brushes dipped in ink and loyalty, by scholars who decide which names belong in the scrolls and which are erased, by emperors who live forever in stone, while the women behind their walls vanish like mist. But some stories survive, not because they are written down, but because they refuse to be forgotten. They say the Forbidden City still breathes, that its walls remember, that if you walk alone in the garden at dusk, you might see her, not her face, not her voice, but the shape of her. A woman who walks with purpose, but leaves no footprints. A shadow that watches, not with malice, but with memory. She was not the only one. The concubines were more than flowers in a painted garden, more than ornaments in red and gold, more than vessels for heirs or sacrifices for rituals. They were girls stolen from their homes, daughters who became possessions, mothers who never saw their children again, sisters who died with silk around their necks because a man's heart stopped beating. And yet, they lived in quiet rebellion, in glances shared between silk curtains, in coded poems sewn into the hems of their robes, in small kindnesses passed in silence. They lived even when they weren't allowed to. Most never escaped. Most never made it to the stories. But some left signs. Scratches beneath floorboards. Ink stains where ink wasn't allowed. A carved name beneath the stone basin in the bathhouse courtyard. Somewhere, right now, a visitor to the old palace may run a finger across a crack in the wall, not knowing that centuries ago, a forgotten woman left her truth there. And if that visitor listens, really listens, they might hear a whisper. I was here. The emperor is gone. The tomb is sealed. The dynasty long buried beneath centuries of dust and politics and curated memory. But this remains a story not of power, but of refusal, of a girl who was told her life was over the moment the emperor died, and who said no, not loudly, not with swords or speeches, but by breathing, by surviving, by existing in a world that said she shouldn't. You asked, what did the concubines do when the emperor died? They dressed in red. They tied silk scarves around their necks. They walked into darkness. But one of them walked out, and through her, the others speak. Not in history books, but here, now, with you, because you listened, and that means they were not forgotten.